Okay, so my name is Pippa Day, and I am a product of Fort Bend ISD. I went to elementary school, middle school, and high school here in the district. I have been a teacher in the district, and I have also been an elementary school counselor in the district. I want to say that this is like my 15th year. I haven't counted in a long time. But this topic is very close to my heart. Gifted and gay when GT meets LGBT. And I have two children at home, one who currently identifies as heterosexual, and then one who I, I would say is questioning, but potentially trans. It depends on who you ask in the house. And that's something that we can talk about when we get to the Q&A portion. Okay, so very quickly, I'm just going to gloss over giftedness and then we will get into the nuts and bolts. So, as all of you are probably aware, giftedness is a neurological difference. The biggest thing that I have seen with gifted children and non gifted children is a different intellectual, academic, and social emotional development. Um, and we'll talk about that asynchrony in just a little bit, but that is the biggest thing that I have seen when talking to both. Most gifted children can comprehend material that's several grade levels above their same age peers. They have this huge emotional depth and sensitivity, even at a young age, a strong sense of curiosity. They ask some of the most amazing questions that completely throw me for loops. They have an enthusiasm about unique interests and topics that can be very wide ranging or very narrow. They can have a really quirky or mature sense of humor. Sometimes I forget that I'm talking to children when I'm talking to my two, because their sense of humor is so mature. They also have these incredible ways to problem solve and to express their ideas. They can be very imaginative and creative. They are also very aware. They're aware of themselves. They're aware of the world around them, whether that be in the school setting or a global setting. They definitely are aware of a lot of things. But remember, every gifted student is unique. Some may have all of these traits. Some may have a couple of them really intensely, and some might not show any of them at all. Um, but this asynchronous development tends to be the hallmark of um, of giftedness, and that is basically their development is uneven in their academic growth, their emotional growth, their physical growth, their social growth doesn't all happen at the same time. They have a tendency to develop different skills at different rates. For example, a child may be operating at a 10th grade level and they're 9, but they can't figure out how to ride a bike. Or a 5-year-old can do high level math, but still can't completely get toilet trained. And this asynchrony can be really frustrating, especially for the child, because their intellect is not matching up with what their body is capable of doing, or they just can't emotionally handle everything that's going on. And the higher that a child's IQ is, the greater that asynchrony is. And I wanted to show you this pie chart because I'm visual and it helps me see. You've got this circle here that shows their chronological age, but where they are in their development is very different depending on where their gifts are. So they also have what they call intensities, which is the way that gifted people approach life. The positive to that is that they have this amazing passion that enables them to achieve the most amazing things. But they also have the negative of these intensities, which is the turmoil that just consumes them because they just don't know how to handle the fact that it's not growing all together, but at different times. Sometimes this can be internalizing, which will be moodiness or anxiety, or it can be externalizing, which could be tantrums or, just getting angry for no reason, it seems. And a lot of times these intensities come out when the world is not aligning with how they think it should be. These kids are the ones who get really upset over ethical issues. They do not like when you do not follow the rules a certain way at playtime. These are the kids that are questioning existential problems at a really young age. They just can't seem to wrap their brain around these things. So, along with the intensities, they also have overexcitabilities, which is a heightened sensitivity or intensity in a certain area. And I think it's interesting that that word came from a translation of a Polish word whose literal meaning is super stimulatability. These are present at birth. It's not something that they grow into, but this is what allows them to see the world in a different way. It sort of is what builds their giftedness. Um, and not all gifted people have these overexcitabilities, but researchers have shown that these overexcitabilities are stronger in gifted people than in intellectually average people. So just to go over really quickly the 5 overexcitabilities, the psychomotor is a heightened excitability of the neuromuscular system. These are the kids that can't sit still. They're super active and energetic. They just love to move. This can often be misdiagnosed as ADHD, and I am firmly convinced that this is where my son is because he did not get diagnosed with ADHD, but the child cannot sit still. And I think that part of that is that psychomotor overexcitability. Then you've also got the sensual one, which sounds kind of sexy, but is totally not. It's all about the 5 senses, right? Our, see, hear, taste, smell, those sorts of things. These people tend to be your emotional eaters. They'll go spend a lot of money because it makes them feel better. They love being the center of attention. They need those senses stimulated, but they can also withdraw if they feel overstimulated. So when you have a kid that completely shuts down, it might be an overexcitability in the sensual department. Then we've also got intellectual overexcitability. These are the ones that have to know the answers to everything. It's not just that they're intelligent, it's that they have to know why. They have to really understand. These are the kids that like to think about thinking. They're super meta and very moralistic. They want to know the why. Then we've got imaginational overexcitability, and these are the ones who can fall into fantasy at a moment's notice. A lot of times they will sort of go off on their own little tangent when they need to be focusing on something else, but they're just so deep in their imagination. And then you've got the emotional overexcitability, which is just complex, extreme emotion. These are like empaths. They feel what other people feel. They also have really deep relationships, which aren't always reciprocated because they're feeling so deeply, but the other person might not be. They make strong emotional attachments to people, places, or things, and they are always carrying on an inner dialogue, and they're probably their harshest critic. So when you think about all of those things, and then you look at the LGBTQ statistics, you can see how some of this overlaps. So the thing that makes me really sad are these statistics here. 98% of students who identify as being LGBTQ have heard someone use gay in a negative way. The biggest one I hear is, oh, that's so gay. So that's 98%. I mean, we're talking only 2% of those students said, I've never heard that. And 95% of those people heard it in other types of homophobic remarks. And I'm not even going to repeat those. But that's a huge population of people who are hearing horrible things about themselves and how they identify. 95% of these students heard negative remarks about gender expression, like you're not being masculine enough to be a boy, or you're not being feminine enough to be a girl. And then 85% of those heard negative remarks specifically about transgender people, either calling them trannies or calling them he, she's, which can be really emotionally draining. And then 56% of students reported that they heard teachers and staff in their school make homophobic remarks, and 63% of those heard negative remarks about gender expression. And in this day and age, when even more kids are starting to fall under that Q category, that's not okay. And so what is Q? That Q for most LGBTQ people is sort of an umbrella term for all sexualities and genders that don't necessarily fall within lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So it could be intersex, and those are people who are born with a combination of male and female biological characteristics. Asexual, if you're just not sexually attracted to any gender. pansexual, which I've been learning a whole lot about at my house, which is attraction without any regard to gender. I'm still trying to learn the difference between pan and bi because they're very close. But this one is basically, you fall in love with a soul and not necessarily with a gender. And then questioning. These are the people who are keeping their options open while they question and figure out who they are and what their sexual identity or true gender is. And then the allies, those who support members of the LGBTQ community. So we could even consider ourselves under that Q umbrella as allies to our children who are going through this right now. So this is the sad thing. When I was prepping for this presentation, wow, was there a dearth of information out there? The internet, I could read about gifted kids all day. I could read about LGBTQ kids all day, but when it came to combining the two together, there was not a ton of information out there. Researchers found that there were only 2 studies done in the 90s that focused on both gifted and LGBTQ students. One was about suicidal ideation and depression, and then the other one was about the educational needs of gifted gay and bisexual males. So even then, we didn't have a whole lot of information. Now, in the early 2000s, 3 more studies came out. One was talking about homosexuality and sexual identity issues being risk factors for suicide for teens. Another talked about the burden of being twice different and how that related to depression and isolation. And then another one focused on depressive disorders in highly gifted students. So even now, we are still building information that we can learn about these kids. And honestly, they need help because they are double identified. So that intersection of gifted and gay, this creates a set of very specific social and emotional issues that the general population never has to confront. When they're both gifted and gay, these issues now are even bigger. That sense of difference likely intensifies when both occur together. So here are the numbers, because I thought this was really interesting. So they say that approximately 3 to 5% of the population is gifted. Okay, so then, though estimates vary, they say that 3 to 10% of people are a sexual minority, LGBTQ. But based on these percentages, they say the chances of being both gifted and a sexual minority would be 1 to 3 in 1,000. So a really small number. But they did a study of 53 LGBTQ youth in urban support groups, and they found that more than a third of them had been in specialized gifted programs at their school. And although 53 is a really small sample, it just goes to show you that there is a really high percentage of overlap between being gifted and feeling like you are a sexual minority. And so this shows that this intersection of these two things needs to be addressed and deserves more attention. So what I went looking for is, why is there such an overlap? And what I found was they say that gifted students are more likely to identify as LGBTQ because they have such a questioning, exploratory nature. Being gifted means that they're going to want to know more about lots of things, and that includes sexuality. Gifted kids are less likely to conform to social norms, and they're more likely to accept ambiguity and diversity than their non-gifted peers. Basically, they have a bigger heart for these types of situations. And what's interesting is the number of students who consider themselves questioning has grown exponentially, and it's been embraced by teens and preteens across the country. They're calling it the Q movement. So they were thinking, why is this happening? They said that it's possibly a way for these kids to sort of ease into these orientations. Maybe they've always felt that they were gay, but they're not fully ready to embrace it. It could be a temporary rebellion because they just don't like how society labels us. Or it could be that our views of a binary gender, of a male and a female, are just wrong. And with the growth of the internet, these kids have so much more information at their fingertips than I ever did when I was their age. So they're understandably much better informed and educated on the nuances of gender and sexuality than any of us previous. I mean, I learned about stuff like this through Beverly Cleary books, and instead they can go online and go to chat rooms where they're, or, things like that, where they're talking to people who have felt this way. So it's so much different. Okay. The other thing about gifted kids is they tend to be more androgynous than their non-gifted same age peers. Gifted boys tend to display a sensitivity and an empathy that is often considered very feminine. And then the girls may demonstrate an independence and an aggressiveness that is more associated with masculinity. So they don't really fit that box of being super girly girls or really macho boys because they have those overexcitabilities and intensities that make them a little bit more androgynous. And what's interesting is few gifted people conform to those gender role stereotypes. They reject these strict gender identities that we have all learned as we were growing up. What I found very interesting is as they were young, gifted girls and gifted boys tended to be more similar to each other than they were to their non-gifted same gender peers. So a gifted girl would be have much more in common with a gifted boy than she would with a non-gifted girl. And I found that really fascinating because I can see that in my own home. But during adolescence, this androgyny can cause a lot of confusion about gender identity. And this is where I am in my house right now. Is it androgyny or is there a gender dysphoria issue going on? So a lot of times these kids will sort of break out of the mold by becoming exaggeratedly feminine, exaggeratedly macho, trying to get themselves established as that biological gender, or they'll go to the other extreme and take on external traits of the other gender. They're just not quite sure where they fit because on the continuum, they tend to fall more in the middle. Okay, so what I also thought was really interesting was the disadvantages that kids said of being gifted and the disadvantages of kids that were LGBTQ. And if you'll notice, the top two are the same. Both of them had great fears of social isolation and bullying and teasing. But for the gifted kids, they had a lot of trouble relating to their peers and feeling bored and frustrated in school, where the LGBTQ students had a fear of being harassed and a fear of coming out to other people. So what happens when you're both? Obviously, you're doubly scared of that social isolation, and you have even more ammunition for being bullied or teased. So these students consider themselves in social emotional double jeopardy. It's basically they've created a huge target on themselves. So they feel like their difficulties are bigger. Those feelings of being different intensify. They're more vulnerable to verbal and physical abuse at school. And they now have these stronger feelings of being marginalized both outside with other people and inside their own bodies. So as a result, a unique difficulty that they had was this tendency to overthink and overachieve. So what are the pluses and minuses of this overthinking? So a lot of times they feel like they have to choose between being academically successful or being accepted socially. So some students will be these huge academic overachievers or athletic overachievers. And so they will do even more than they're supposed to. Perhaps they become perfectionists or they become super involved in extracurricular activities. And this is the way that in their brains, they're making up for being both gifted and gay. But others will be more self-destructive. Maybe they'll drop out of school, they'll run away, they'll abuse drugs and alcohol, or they'll attempt or complete suicide because they just can't get out of their own heads. The sad statistic that I found was very few of these kids will seek help from adults. And they're not sure if it's because they just don't have a suitable model or mentor, or if there's just a lack of helpful resources out there for them. And that makes me really sad. That makes me even more passionate to know more about this topic. So they asked gifted and gay kids, which is worse? And so they asked them, who has more or fewer difficulties? Gifted heterosexual students or non-gifted LGBTQ students? And 86% of them said that being gifted and gay led to far more difficulties than just being gifted or just being gay. So they said that the LGBTQ side of that dual identity led to more problems than the gifted side, because they said that there was a lack of support for LGBTQ and there was that taboo nature of being considered part of that community. They felt that the gifted students had more support available to them, because even though their peers may tease them for being really smart, they're still looked on very highly by adults, right? The adults still want to help them because they are so smart, but they didn't feel like the same could be said as teachers want to help them because they were gay. So what do these dual identity kids need? I found it interesting. Students became aware of their giftedness much earlier than they became aware of their sexual identity or orientation. So they became aware of their giftedness on average about 7 years old. They began to question their sexual orientation, average about 13, and then they were certain about it by age 16. At my house, this started at a much earlier age than 13. But again, it's just an average. So because they're both gifted and gay, they have unique needs related to their strengths and their social challenges, because both their identity, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, and their giftedness can affect their experience of their social and emotional development. So we really have to look at the difference between, are we tolerating their sexual identity, their sexual orientation, or are we integrating that difference into the curriculum, into how we address them, all of that. And I find that that's something that we really need to look at, because I feel like we are really looking more through the tolerance lens at best and not the integrated lens. So what can parents do for kids who are considered both gifted and LGBTQ? The first thing is to avoid reinforcing any stereotypical behaviors, right? Only girls cook, only boys get muddy, those sorts of things. And we need to support where they feel like they fall in their gender roles and their androgyny. If they feel like certain things make them feel happy that might be more feminine, then we can go ahead and encourage those interests. Same thing with something that might fall more toward the masculine side. So they shouldn't be discouraged or criticized for things that they find interesting, but we should respect, value, and nurture those interests, just like we do when we see that they are really good at math or they're amazing writers. We want to nurture those talents just as much as their academic ones. Okay, this is the thing that I have to tell myself all the time as a parent. However challenging this may be for me, it is, and I don't want to get upset, but it's 10 times harder for my kid. And so I think about what my child goes through every day and how brave my kid is to want to live a very open life. And I have to remind myself that is a choice that my kid made, and that I have to respect that, because it's not my challenge, it's theirs. Because if you think about it, they're terrified that we're going to abandon them, that their peers are going to ostracize them. That can contribute to depression, suicidal thoughts, and hiding things from us. That is the one thing that I have really talked to my own kid about, is you can tell me anything and I will be there to help you. We had an issue at the end of the first semester where a kid was videotaping my child in a classroom and posted it on a social media site with a bunch of really ugly names and descriptions. And I was obviously horrified and super angry. Now, luckily, the school handled it so well, but that's not okay. And I have an elementary school student and a middle school student. So, these are young kids that are doing these things already. And so that's why it's so important for us parents. We need to advocate. We need to advocate to our schools that they need to not only identify these students, but they have to acknowledge them and try and help them out. So overarching, what can schools do? Not a lot of kids feel like the schools don't adequately support them. So I think it's really important that all school staff should receive professional development related to creating and sustaining safe environments for these gifted LGBTQ kids. They need to know that when they're at school, they're safe and they are around people that maybe don't understand what they're going through, but are there for them. We need to make sure that the schools are teaching curriculums that is inclusive, not only for gifted, but for everybody, and that they include positive examples of individuals that have all kinds of sexual orientations and gender identities. These kids need to be able to see themselves in some of the stuff that they're studying. We need to make sure that there are safe zones or people that they can talk to help protect and nurture these unique sensitivities, the overexcitabilities, the intensities that these kids have. They need to be protected and nurtured. And we need to make sure that we use very inclusive language in school correspondence. For example, saying dear parents instead of dear mom and dad. Most schools do that, right? But we want to make sure that we're respecting all kinds of sexual orientations and gender identities. Because here's the thing, I don't know of any, I'm trying to think of a teacher that any of my kids have had or that I know of who identified as LGBTQ who actually talked about having a partner. I don't think that any of my coworkers who were in committed LGBTQ relationships ever mentioned that they had a partner. It was very taboo, and for some it still is. And I want to make sure that we can advocate for them that they should be okay to be that role model for kids who are in their same situation. So at the elementary level, we just need to increase the level of acknowledgement of different lifestyles. I feel through inclusive curriculum that shows different types of families. Maybe it shows a kid with two moms or with two dads, or talking about how one of their moms used to be a man. I think that it's okay for us to introduce this information to them at the elementary level. We definitely need to provide tolerance and sensitivity lessons to our students so they understand that it's not okay to tease other kids who might be different from them. Asking teachers to call out students for using inappropriate language. Like if a kid says, "Oh, that's so gay," that they stop them and explain why it's not okay to say that. Instead of celebrating muffins with moms or donuts with dads, that we have some sort of family day instead to make every type of family feel welcome. And there's a book by Tom Parr. It's called The Family Book, and it's all about LGBTQ families, but showing any types of books like that that show children of a similar age that there's all different types of families, that it's not just the mom-dad parental unit. At the middle school level, include general LGBTQ knowledge and health classes. I'm not saying that we have to explain the birds and the bees to these kids, but that it's okay for a man to love another man and to marry him, or it's okay for a child to feel at a very young age that they got put in the wrong body. We need to normalize that. Creating a gay straight alliance or other support group at the middle school level, I think would go a long way. They don't have that right now at my child's middle school, and I think it would be really helpful. Potentially have panels or speakers come out to expose students to people that fall under the LGBTQ umbrella. Emphasizing appropriate language and tolerance, which we've carried over from elementary, because middle school can be super cruel. And this is a really good time for them to understand these differences. And present story problems or assignments in classes where characters perform activities that are stereotypically performed by the opposite gender. Let's celebrate that androgyny, right? Tom makes cookies. Pam builds a house, those sorts of things. And then at the high school level, continue providing those gay straight alliances or other support groups on campus, but this time add an emphasis on school-wide advocacy. So we're advocating for them to everyone, not just to that alliance or support group. And then provide assignments that ask students to consider gender orientation or identity or sexual orientation. So, for example, discuss the ways in which Walt Whitman's homosexuality may have influenced his poetry. And any student can do that. But allowing kids to see examples that fall into their worth would be really helpful. Provide school-wide tolerance activities, create small groups in which students can discuss these issues. Again, teaching lessons about inappropriate language and adopting anti-discrimination policies, which includes sexual minority students as a protected group. And always refrain from using out students to act as spokespeople. They may be well-informed, but you shouldn't make them the voice of the students. Okay, we're almost done. I'm sorry. I've been talking for a really long time. So in conclusion, while we've been talking a lot about the disadvantages, these kiddos who are both gifted and gay have some incredible advantages. They have such a unique and interesting perspective on the world. They have an incredibly strong sense of self after doing all of this emotional thinking about who they are. And they have that deep thinking to problem solve. I know that I cannot wait for this generation to grow up and become voters and legislators because they're going to change the world. And so that's why it's so important for us to nurture these strengths, to nurture that healthy development and those self-advocacy skills so that they can be their best advocate and they don't feel like they are going to be run over by these other kids. And we need to be allies. Any small act of kindness that we can do, any visible support will make them feel safer, less lonely, and worthy of respect and kindness. I don't know if you can see, but right behind me, I have my ally sticker. And that was, I bought it without my kids knowing. And that was probably, I think that's the only time that I ever saw my kid get a little like teary, was because that one thing made them feel like my mom's really trying.